Hey Florida 4-H, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this webinar and prepare yourself in becoming a candidate for a Florida 4-H state officer. As an overview of what to expect throughout this webinar, we will go over candidate requirements, completing your packet as a whole, things to consider before submitting, time commitments, financial commitments, other various commitments. You can tell there's a lot of commitments and big responsibility that comes along with being a state officer. The timeline of our officer elections happening this summer. Things to consider when becoming nominated and putting together your speeches. And then some other odds and ends. If you're considering becoming a candidate for a state officer position in Florida 4-H, you have to make sure you meet these following requirements. So number one, you have to have been a 4-H member for at least 3 years, including the current 4-H year. Number two, you have to be an officially seated county voting delegate to the state council. So this means that there can only be 2 people from each county that can run for a state officer position. Number three, you have to have approval from a parent or guardian. There's a lot that goes into being a state officer, so we want to make sure you have the support from your family. Number four, you have to have approval from county 4-H faculty or staff. Again, a lot of things go into being a state officer, so we want to make sure that your faculty and staff members are aware of the impacts that this may have on your involvement at the county and district levels. And then number five, you have to have been active executive board member for at least 1 term, which means 1 full 4-H year. And for this current year, we have changed the requirements for attending executive boards to only have to attended 1 executive board instead of the 2 that it has been in previous years. So if you can check off all 5 of these circles, all 5 of these requirements, then you are an eligible officer candidate. Now that you know that you are eligible to be a state officer candidate, what does a complete application packet look like? All of this information can be found on florida4h.org at our state officer application page. So you want to start by looking at that application, and this will collect a lot of basic information as well as signatures from your parent or guardian and 4-H agent. And also in that document, you'll have 3 essay questions that you'll want to answer with 150 to 200 words apiece. Then you'll need to put together a 4-H resume, particularly focusing in on the 4-H experiences, impacts, and accomplishments that you've had in 4-H thus far. And then we'll need 2 recommendation forms, one being from a 4-H agent, preferably. If you do not have a 4-H agent in your county, then this can be from a 4-H program assistant or a county extension director. And then that second recommendation form being from a non-agent. And we do not need letters of recommendations. There are particular forms on the website mentioned earlier for these people to fill out. So now you know that you're eligible to be a state officer candidate. You know what it's going to take to have a complete packet, but there are some things to consider and do before submitting. So the first thing is congratulations. You're already doing it by watching this webinar. The second is to make sure you read the candidate information packet on the website. And this includes a lot of information that we're going over today in this webinar, but in a lot more detail. And then you need to also make sure you read the State 4-H Council Constitution and bylaws. And also the final thing is that you need to make sure that you meet with your 4-H faculty or staff to discuss why you're running, what has prepared you to be a state officer, what your platform is going to be, meaning what change you feel like you can have effect over as a state officer, and then how this is going to affect other 4-H participation at the county and district level. As mentioned earlier, becoming a state officer means that there's going to be a lot more of a commitment to the 4-H program. And one of those commitments comes with your time. So you can look over here at all the dates that come along with being a state officer. Now there are a couple of mandatory ones that you will need to make sure that you're at, but there's also some that are highly encouraged but not necessarily mandatory. So if we're looking at our mandatory ones, we're talking about the officer training in August, the first executive board in October, the second executive board in January, and one that many people don't know as much about is the state fair opening. And this is so that we can have great representation from Florida 4-H at both the Fresh from Florida breakfast as well as the governor's luncheon. Then third executive board, and 4-H Day at the Capitol. Then when we look at intermediate state, 4-H legislature, and 4-H university, these would be great ones to have as many state officers at as possible, but they're only mandatory if you are on the planning committee for one of those events. The second set of commitments that you want to consider are the financial ones. Now, there are a decent amount of things that Florida 4-H covers, but there are some things that we'll ask you to cover as a state officer. So in the Florida 4-H side, we'll cover registrations for executive boards, any costs associated for officer training retreats, lodging for opening day at the state fair, lodging and registration for 4-H Day at the Capitol, and then registration for 4-H Leadership Adventure Weekend and Intermediate State. Then, to make sure you're looking top-notch as a state officer, we'll provide a green officer blazer and a tie to go with that, as well as a name tag and an officer polo. Then on your side for cover, you'll need to provide the rest of the officer uniform, which those pieces are listed there. You'll also need to provide coverage for your travel to and from events, and then registration costs for 4-H University and 4-H Legislature. Then the third set of commitments are ones that don't really fall into any singular categories. So the first one in this is public relations and being the face of Florida 4-H. You'll want to make sure that as soon as you become a state officer, you're considering the image that you are giving of Florida 4-H at all times in anything that you do, either in person, on social media, and through any communication you may make on behalf of Florida 4-H. And then there's also time that's going to need to be dedicated between the events talked about earlier. And this may include conference calls, meetings, planning sessions, anything of that sort. And if you talk to any current state officer, they'll tell you that there's been some times where I will reach out to them on a Monday trying to get together a meeting for a Wednesday because of an urgent need. Now, we try not to do that all of the time, and those aren't necessarily mandatory, but you'll just want to be aware of those and be as flexible as possible when you can. And then there's other events by request that may be asked of you. So recently, an officer was asked to go speak at a flagpole dedication in Flagler County. And then there's lots of events similar to that you may be asked to represent Florida 4-H at different times throughout the year. And then finally, a big aspect of your role as a state officer is to represent the state program in the different counties across Florida. So there's 67 counties in Florida, and we try to split these up as evenly and as best as possible between the 8 state officers that we have, taking into account their location, what is accessible to them, and what's easy for them to get around to. We wouldn't necessarily assign somebody that lives in South Florida a county that's in the Panhandle, but we will assign counties that are close by, and you'll be a resource to those 4-H agents and faculty and staff members to be able to call on if they would like representation at a banquet or for you to lead a workshop for their councils. So there's a lot of different options there. Now that you're aware of what the commitments will look like throughout the year as a state officer, you'll probably want to know what it's going to look like to be elected during this summer. So on July 27th, we'll have a Zoom meeting with the State Council, and this is where nominations will be made and you will give prepared speeches as a candidate. And then on July 28th, through Zoom as well, we'll have a town hall with the State Council, and you'll be asked questions from the outgoing officers to provide impromptu speeches. And then on July 28th and 29th, voting will occur through Qualtrics survey. And then on July 29th, if you do not receive an elected position, you have the opportunity to be interviewed for an appointed position, and you'll be made aware of those times on that date. And then on July 30th, we're going to announce the state officers at the 4-H University live broadcast. While looking at that officer election timeline, you may be wondering what the nomination and speech process is going to look like. So looking at the nominations, this is going to happen at that first state council meeting on July 27th through Zoom, and you have to be nominated by a voting delegate. And this means they have to say your name and that they nominate you, and then you have to accept that nomination. And once nominations are accepted, you will give a prepared speech. And in this speech, you're going to discuss how you plan to make the 4-H program stronger as a state officer, what positive impact that you hope to leave as a state officer, and really look at inspiring those that are going to be voting for you to get behind you and give you their vote. And so the order for that is going to go as seen on the screen: the reporter, treasurer, secretary, vice president, and then president. And presidential candidates will be given 3 minutes to speak, and the other candidates will be given 2 minutes. Then, during that town hall and impromptu speech time on July 28th, you'll actually be asked a question from an outgoing officer that pertains to leadership within 4-H. And you'll be given a couple of seconds, maybe 30 seconds to a minute, and you'll be able to think about an answer and then give that to the state council. And the order for this is a reporter, treasurer, secretary, vice president, and president, similar to the prepared speech. And again, presidential candidates will be given 3 minutes, and other candidates will be given 2 minutes. And finally, to wrap up this whole presentation, we have a couple of odds and ends that would need to be considered when running to be a state officer. The first of those being campaigning. So while this will look a little different from past years of in-person 4-H universities, we will be having virtual campaigning. And we don't know the exact specifics of this yet, but we know that there's going to be a heavy emphasis on graphic design. And we encourage the use of Canva since this is a free and easy to use platform, but you can use whatever is best fit for your abilities. And then there's going to be a great educational opportunity through our 4-H Adventures programs this summer. And this is called Unleashing the Power of Your Story. So everyone has a story, and stories are powerful tools that can affect change. Join us to discover the power in your story and how to unleash it towards positive change in your community, country, and world. And throughout our time together in this 4-H adventure, we will be able to identify what makes up your personal life story, how to leverage it into a vision for the future, and how to inspire others towards that future. And this educational opportunity will be great for those running to be a state officer. It's not mandatory, but it is definitely highly encouraged to participate in this if you are planning to run for a state officer position. Registration and information for this will go out on May 15th, and I will specifically make sure to send it around to all executive board members so that they can take part in this great opportunity. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this webinar. I know that it is a requirement in order to become a state officer candidate, but I recognize the time that it takes to sit and take in this information, so I appreciate you taking that time today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, Derby Sale, the Citizenship Leadership Coordinator for Florida 4-H, at the email listed on this slide, sderby.sale@ufl.edu, with any questions you may have. And I look forward to seeing all of the state officer candidates that are going to come forward this year and seeing the strong team that's going to be elected for this coming year.